With commitment and grace, Aryeh Green advocates on behalf of Israel and Jews all over the world. Tonight, he is going to help us all to become strong advocates, infusing us with a new vocabulary for reawakening Zionism. So let's get to it. Please join me in welcoming Aryeh Green.
Wow, was that kind of a build-up? I'm really honored and humbled to be with you today. And I want to thank Holly and your husband, Armin, who's, I presume, here somewhere, Armin, and Rabbi Palmer, and Jessica for the warmth of your welcome. And I want to thank all of you for the very warm embrace that I felt even just being here for just a few hours. It's actually, for me, a great pleasure to come to a community that I've never been in before. I've heard that there were some Jews in Milwaukee. I know there was one famous one that, before I did, came to Israel and spent a few years there. And I'm sure most of you are tired of hearing about the Golda Meirs and Golda Meir as the one famous Israeli coming from Milwaukee. But I actually have a few friends in Beit Shemesh who have some connections to Milwaukee as well. So thank you very much for your welcome, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm really humbled to speak with you about the idea of awakening Zionism, because I'm not quite sure how to approach the subject other than from my own personal experience. And so what I'd like to do over the next 30 or 40 minutes is to share with you some thoughts and ideas that come out of my experience of living in Israel for 35 years, as a direct descendant of one of the first Jewish families to come to America. My family came to America in 1720. And my identity as an American Jew who lives in Israel for the last 3+ decades is very much part of the story that I'm happy to share with you, and some elements of which I share in the book that I wrote. But let's begin by picture this. On the side of a cliff in the what's called Nachal Amud, a canyon coming down from Tzfat, the holy city of Safed, on the way down to the Keynote, to the Sea of the Galilee. Hiking down on a very, very hot morning, coming across the side of a cliff on a path, and I don't need to exaggerate, it's literally this wide. And I'm walking with my left side against the cliff, and I'm walking, and I come to a point where it just stops. It just stops. I'd lost the trail. Now, the problem was that I'm standing on the cliff, and actually this will help me to demonstrate. I'm standing here next to the cliff. There's about a 40-foot drop to the rocks below. I have a 50-pound pack on my back. If I turn this way, the pack bangs against the cliffside. If I turn this way to try and turn around, I'm in danger of losing my balance and falling and injuring myself, or worse. And I begin to panic. I just don't know what to do. And at that point, thank God for Thomas Crumb's book, 3 Deep Breaths. I took 3 deep breaths to center myself, to focus, to think about the possibilities that I had in front of me. And very slowly, I let the pack drop to the ground, very carefully. And that's when I retraced my steps. I found where I had lost the trail. There were some hand holds on the cliffside where you were supposed to go up, and I had missed that. And then I figured out what I needed to do, and I walked back, and as I put the pack on, carefully, so as not to fall off the cliff, I found that the pack was lighter. That doesn't make any sense. Nothing had changed in the pack. Nothing had changed in terms of, my status, but what had changed was my attitude. I had found where I needed to be. I had allowed myself after the panic to focus, to center myself, to calm down, and I could understand then what I needed to do. And as I put the pack back on and carefully turned and retraced my steps, I just realized that the pack hadn't changed. I had changed. I think this is a metaphor for sometimes in our lives, as individuals or even as a nation, that sometimes we have to put our bags down and reevaluate. We have to stop and think about where we've come from and where we are at the moment and where we're trying to get to. And I use that metaphor as a way of introducing a general concept tonight that when we talk about reawakening Zionism, especially in the last 4 days, we were just discussing, Ilana, is it? Ilana and I were just discussing in your role as the head of the JCRC of how infuriating it can be to work with the media or with some public figures or others who simply don't understand the complexities of the issues that we're dealing with over there in Israel. And in the last few days, we have all, I think, felt, whether it's anger or frustration or otherwise, the simplistic way that some of the issues have been presented, whether it's the question of the riots and the attacks going on in the border with Gaza, or some of the issues related to the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel by the United States and the like. Sometimes we're so overwhelmed with the activism that we're pursuing or with the issues that we're dealing with that we don't take a step back and reassess and rekindle our sense of wonder at the generation that we live in and at the miracle that we are privileged to be witness to, and many of us, some of you as well, with homes in Jerusalem or the frequent trips that you take to visit Israel, that we're able actually to live as part of our lives. Well, it's true. I hiked the Israel National Trail, 600 miles, as Holly mentioned, all alone. Took about 8 weeks with a 50-pound pack on my back. It was, let's just say, a challenge for a 51-year-old. This is something the 21-year-old crowd really is wont to do. But it was much more than a physical challenge. For me, it was an emotional and psychological challenge and transformative experience. I had just given my wife a get. We had just finalized a divorce, which I hadn't looked for, which was not my choice. It was a devastating, traumatic experience for me and a very difficult period in my life. And 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I was out on the trail. I grew up in California, and I have done backpacking before and hiking in Israel, but never something of this magnitude. I seriously didn't know what I was getting into. I asked myself time after time, what am I doing? What am I trying to prove? And why am I there? But in the end, the 8 weeks of hiking from Eilat in the south to the border with Lebanon in the north, all through the Negev mountains and the hills and forests of the Galilee, through the coastal plain on the coast of the Mediterranean and north of Tel Aviv, and in the hills hiking up to and then down from Jerusalem, I experienced a real transformation. And I reached a number of conclusions, which not only helped me, the lessons that I learned on the trail to actually complete the trail, but they helped me to quite literally move on with my life. And that's why I wrote the book that I wrote. The combination of hiking the land of Israel and having a connection to our people and our history and the land itself, and the lessons that I learned, sort of a personal growth story that might be helpful to others facing their own personal challenges. My book focuses on the trek itself, but that's not really our topic for tonight. As Holly said, we're celebrating 70 years of Israel. We just celebrated, and you did in the shul, Yerushalayim, Yom Yerushalayim, which just coincidentally happened to be the day before the world's only superpower made up for 70 years of oversight and finally recognize the reality of Jerusalem as the eternal capital of the Jewish people, and of course, the capital of our modern nation state. So I think it's a perfect time to reevaluate our commitment to Israel, our understanding of what Zionism is, and to a certain extent to rekindle our love affair with Israel. And I'm connecting it to my hike in my book because it's kind of funny. We're standing now in the week in which we're about to read Parshat Bamidbar. Numbers, as it's translated in English, for a number of reasons in terms of the Pikudim, but Bamidbar means in the desert. And half of the hike in the Israel Trail was in the desert. If I have a chance, I'll share with you one or two of the fascinating experiences that I had in the desert as part of the hike. But the idea of having a little bit of distance from the noise of every day is very much connected to being out in the desert and the silence that the desert provides as a time of contemplation. And as we celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut, Yom Yerushalayim, read Parshat Bamidbar, and move towards Shavuot, another opportunity for contemplating our connection with the land of Israel, the people of Israel, and of course the Torah of Israel, given, not coincidentally, in the desert, I think it's a good time to take a little bit of the humility that I learned in the desert on my hike and to think and contemplate and reevaluate our connection to our Zionism. I want to do so in a very practical way, because to a certain extent, one aspect of our Zionism today is how we relate to those who engage in public discourse about Israel or about Zionism. You know, the first 50 years of Zionism, the first 50 years of the last century, Zionism was defined as being involved in or giving money to or actually working towards the establishment of our renewed sovereignty, the establishment of our modern nation state in our ancestral homeland. And the second 50 years of Zionism, as I see it, the second half of the last century, was involved in an effort to, I guess I would say, build up that country, it having been established in 1948. Investment, building the infrastructure, building up the society, bringing in gathering the exiles from Russia and Ethiopia and Yemen and Morocco and America and England and Western Europe. So what is Zionism today? We've established the state that those first 50 years worked towards. And we've built up that state into a modern economic and military and social miracle, leading the world, not just in innovation, in high-tech and biotech and the like, but also leading the world in terms of the values that we in the Western world hold dear of democracy and freedom and civil rights and human rights and helping others across the planet when they are facing catastrophes or the like. Today, Zionism, I think, is defined as supporting Israel, as fighting and struggling to make sure that the reality of Israel is understood. The image of Israel in public discourse, which is so warped when presented in the media or by too many of our public leaders or church leaders or certainly on the college campuses. Zionism today can be defined, of course, moving to Israel and making Aliyah is an important element. Building up a state is an important element and defending it physically. But today's Zionism, especially outside of Israel, but also inside, is focused on defending and promoting the proper and correct and accurate image of Israel in the media and in the public sphere. So I want to relate to one of the biggest myths that today permeate public discourse, including in coverage of yesterday's and last week's and the previous week's incidents on the border with Gaza, and also with regard to the recognition of Jerusalem as our capital. And that myth, if we understand it properly, understanding the myth will give us the tools to respond to it in appropriate ways. That myth is the idea that we are in the midst of some form of territorial struggle between the Israelis and the Arabs, or more specifically those who self-identify as Palestinian. Halavai, as we say in Hebrew, or in Yiddish, Halavai, this was a territorial issue. I have a very good friend named Mohammed Dajjani, who is a Palestinian Arab Muslim thinker and leader, who heads a movement called Wasatiyah, which is the first Arab Muslim movement in Arab society which uses Quranic sources, religious Islamic sources, to pursue what we would consider Rambam's golden path, the middle path, a moderate view of Islam. And if Mohammed Dajjani was standing here with me today, he would be the first to acknowledge that this is not a territorial or national struggle. This is a civilizational struggle between those who deny the legitimacy of the Jews' connection to our ancestral homeland, and therefore who deny the legitimacy of the founding of our nation state 70 years ago, between those and those of us who support and understand the historical reality, the moral and legal and historical basis for the legitimacy of Israel, which of course means of Zionism. What I'm sharing with you, I think, is a truism that most of you are familiar with. The primary cause of conflict in our region, the primary obstacle to peace, is not those nefarious settlements, the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank of the Jordan River. The primary obstacle to peace today between Jews and Arabs in our region is, as it has been for 100 years now, over 100 years, the violent and hostile rejection of the Jews' connection to our ancestral homeland, and therefore the legitimacy of Zionism as a movement and the State of Israel and its founding. Celebrating Jerusalem Day the other day reminded me of a quote. I'll tell you after I give you the quote who said it. Maybe you can guess. "Go forth and defend Jerusalem with all your might," this very public leader said, speaking to his own people. "For every drop of blood spilled there is sacred. At whatever price, do not let the Zionist usurper place his filthy feet anywhere near Al-Aqsa." Who said that? The moderate leader of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, elected to a 4-year term, now serving his 12th year in that 4-year term. That's another myth, that some of the leaders that we have to deal with in the Arab world, and more specifically in the Palestinians, are somehow moderate, because it's a word that the media uses frequently because it's shorthand. There are extremist leaders, like the heads of Hamas and Iran and Hezbollah and Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda, and then there are the moderates, like Mahmoud Abbas. I have no problem in acknowledging that Mahmoud Abbas is less extreme than Hamas or Hezbollah or Iran. But somebody who says those kind of words, which are, and I don't want to go into a tangential lecture about how we can interpret the key phrases he uses, like filthy feet, which has a specific meaning within Islamic, Muslim, and Arab culture. The idea that the Zionists are a usurper is the point I need to drive home now. Which he said, by the way, just a few weeks ago, in talking about how Israel is a colonialist enterprise coming out of Europe. The idea that Mahmoud Abbas is a moderate is patently absurd when you hear on Mother's Day, on Sunday, his praise for a Palestinian Arab woman whose 4 children were either killed in resistance to the occupiers and the occupation or imprisoned for their resistance activities. The issue here is that we have a situation where sanity has somehow gone missing. We need to recognize that there is a truth. This is not a political statement. Reasonable people can disagree whether a Palestinian state ought to be established in the areas known as the West Bank of the Jordan River, the disputed territories, or otherwise historically known as Judea and Samaria. Reasonable people can argue whether Israel should or shouldn't use these or other military means to defend ourselves. Reasonable people can even debate whether or not the timing for the recognition of Jerusalem this week was opportune or not. But debate about specific policy issues is not the focus of where our Zionism should lead us. There are truths here that I'm discussing tonight which are not part of and shouldn't be part of a political debate. For instance, that Jerusalem has been the heart of the Jewish people for at least 2,500 years. And therefore the tacit recognition of the world community that it was reasonable for Israel to have its capital in Jerusalem was there since 1948. It was just the political shenanigans that led us to a situation that the explicit and de jure recognition was so slow in coming. The same can be said about Zionism itself. 100 years ago, it was ubiquitously understood that the Jews who were sovereign once in the land of Israel and had never lost our connection to it, praying 3 times a day towards Jerusalem, mentioning Jerusalem year after year at the end of our Seder and the end of Yom Kippur and other times, where we always had a presence in Jerusalem, and since the early 1800s, a plurality, being the largest single complement in the population of Jerusalem, as well as other cities like Sfat, like Tiberia, and elsewhere. There was a ubiquitous understanding, not only among Christian Zionists in England and America and elsewhere, but by the Western world, that it was perfectly reasonable and legitimate for the Jewish people to want to return and reestablish our sovereignty in the land of Israel. It's almost a linguistic idea that was understood. Am Yisrael was returning to Eretz Yisrael and creating this new modern nation state called Medinat Yisrael. I suppose in English, had we recognized the power of the word Judea, and therefore the difficulty of anybody to argue that it wasn't legitimate for Jews to move to Judea, we might have actually considered, well, our founding fathers did consider, I don't know if you know that, well, the 2 finalists for the naming of the state of Israel were Israel and Judea. But they weren't thinking back then about how English speakers might be more convinced of the validity of the return of Jews to our ancestral homeland if they had called it Judea. They were thinking in a Hebrew idiom, and therefore the Medinat Yisrael came naturally from Am Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, Torah Yisrael, etc. But these are the truths that it's important to recognize. That ubiquitous understanding by the Western world that led to the mandate given to Great Britain for the reestablishment of the Jewish people in their homeland, the understanding, the legitimacy of that gave rise to the San Remo Treaty, to the mandate itself, and the recognition of Israel in 1948 by the United Nations, has somehow been lost. And to a certain extent, in our own internal arguments between right and left, and reform and conservative and orthodox, and conservative and liberal, and the like, we've also lost a little bit of that. We're so involved in making sure that on campus we're fighting on a specific issue to get a specific resolution passed, or to deny a divestment resolution from being passed. We're so intent on some of the topics of the day that we forget to teach our children. We forget to talk amongst ourselves and reinforce what we have in common is an understanding that we as the Jewish people have returned to our ancestral homeland. And understanding that and reinforcing that should be the basis for both our public and our private activities when it comes to trying to inculcate in our community a sense not only of manning the battlefield in defense of Israel, but reminding ourselves why we're doing that. So I'd like to suggest a few specific and tangible things that we can all do, that we can all incorporate in our daily lives, whether it's in conversations with our friends or children or grandchildren, or whether if we have a connection or we write letters to the media, or whether we have a connection to college professors or the campus environment, or to our political leaders. We should first of all recognize something important. And today, actually, this week, is a very good time for us to recognize our identity as a people. You know, there are many names for the holiday of Shavuot that's coming up. Shavuot, obviously, is one of the ones that is most well understood, but another name for it is Atzeret. And why was it called Atzeret by the rabbis in the Gemara? Because it was seen very much like Shmini Atzeret is a chatima, a closing, as it were, of Sukkot. Shavuot is seen, as many of you I'm sure know, as the closing of the period between Pesach and Shavuot. One of the reasons we count the Omer also is the connection between Pesach and Shavuot. But what is that connection? We need to remind ourselves, and we need to have it as part of our public discourse and private with our children, that we were first a nation. The exodus from Egypt, Yetziat Mitzrayim, was the first time, if we look back at the Parshiot in the Torah, the first time God uses the term Am, people, in the Torah to relate to Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, is at Yetziat Mitzrayim, during the exodus from Egypt. We were forged as a people in the hells of slavery in Egypt, and the redemption, the physical redemption of leaving Egypt, well before we received the Torah at Sinai. What does that mean for most of us? Let me ask you a question. I don't know that much about the Milwaukee community, but I've learned slowly in my conversations with many of you that you're a relatively unified community. Let's imagine for a second that a gentleman walks in the back. You know him. He's not observant at all. In fact, I'm going to make it even more explicit. Today is Yom Kippur. And a gentleman who you know is Jewish, born to a Jewish mother or converted, you know this gentleman is Jewish. He walks in at the back of the synagogue on Yom Kippur afternoon eating a cheeseburger. How many of you, raise your hand, would say, this person is not Jewish? Nobody raised your hand. Because we know, we have an understanding of what Jewish peoplehood is. We understand that being a Jew is being a member of a family, being a member of a clan, of a tribe that was Abraham's family, Yaakov, Yitzchak and Yaakov, that became a clan, a tribe, and then a nation as we left Egypt. It's a unique phenomenon in human society that we are a national grouping which also has a religious identity. But we recognize that our religious behaviors, how we relate to our spiritual tradition, is only one element of our family connection as a people. And we recognize that partially because Pesach preceded Shavuot. That the exodus of Egypt, our physical redemption, and the birth of us as a nation preceded the giving of the Torah and our acceptance of the religious obligations, the commandments, the behavioral elements of our spiritual heritage. That's why this is a good time for us now to rekindle that understanding of our peoplehood, which precedes our religious observances. That idea of Klal Yisrael, of us as a kahal, and you are called Kehilat Torah, that obviously already is part of your identity. It's something that we must strengthen. The second aspect of that is understanding that Zionism is not just a political philosophy. Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. And we don't use the language enough in our public discourse that refers to Zionism in a positive fashion. I had a terrific argument with the president of Hillel International years ago, where many Hillel directors were drawing back from, pulling back from using the word Zionism, because they want to be a big umbrella, and they want Jewish students to feel comfortable coming to Hillel for religious services, and so Zionism became a hot potato. And Richard Joel and I agreed in the end that no, what we have to do is not pull back from Zionism, but to reassert the importance of Zionism, because Zionism, as Abba even said, is nothing more and nothing less than the Jewish people's sense of origin and destination in the land linked eternally with its name. And we don't stress enough, especially in the progressive world, which believes in national liberation movements, how we as a people return to our ancestral homeland as the indigenous people of that land, and that Zionism is our national liberation movement. By not using the language that rings in the ears of many of the population today, we almost give up the argument and instead talk about how our military operations, which are defensive in nature, are the most moral of any military force on the planet or in history. A valid point, which I've used frequently, and I'm sure you have also in relating to specific issues. But if you believe that the Israelis are Zionist usurpers, if you don't recognize that the Jews have a connection to the land, and therefore Israel was established as a legitimate modern nation state, reasserting our sovereignty in that land, then it really doesn't matter how moral our military forces are. The fact that we're there is blatantly immoral. And that's what we're up against, not just on college campuses and among European political elites, but more and more today among even our own political leaders here in America. So I would say to you, how do we relate to this? First and foremost, I think it's obvious, but as the Ramchal said, sometimes we need to repeat the obvious, just to remind ourselves. First of all, be informed. I realize that many of you have been following the news in the last 3 or 4 days because of the events in the Gaza border, because of the events, of course, the celebration and the miracle of the Western world finally acknowledging the legitimacy of Jerusalem as our capital. But it's important that you become informed even more of some of the more complex issues that are involved. We have this problem in Israel. I just happened to, somebody sent to me, and I happened to see an Israeli news report about Gaza, which referred to 3 or 4 of the mantras used by the West, not to mention the Arab media, which are just blatantly absurd and false. We have to be more informed. We have to know the details. I'm not going to go into detail now for you, but I urge you to understand, just as one example, Israel's defensive military operations in 1967 are taught in law schools throughout the Western world, even where Israel is not necessarily supported, like the Sorbonne in Paris, as the paradigm of a justified defensive preemptive strike under the terms of the UN Charter. So many people don't know how to put the context of 1967 and the war then in as part of our discourse, that we ended up talking about how in these disputed territories Israel has a claim because we were there once. That's not enough if you want to convince somebody who, milechatchila, from the beginning is already convinced that Israel's in the wrong, that they're a colonialist, usurper, occupier, whatever. I mean, the truth is, Mark Twain once said, if you don't read the newspaper, you are uninformed. And if you do read the newspaper, you are misinformed. So when I say you need to inform yourself, what I'm looking for is to find those sources that you can rely on to make sure that you are well-read and up-to-date, so that when you have the opportunity, or when you take the initiative, like writing a letter to the editor, that you have the knowledge and the information at your fingertips. And I would urge you, I'm sure many of you already do. How many of you, raise your hands, how many of you have written a letter to the editor or something like that, an email, in the last year, in terms of interaction with either national or local media? A few of you. I would urge more of you to do so, and to do so regularly. You cannot imagine, I spent a decade working with international media, the leading media in America and also Europe and elsewhere. The media today is struggling. Every media outlet, CNN, the New York Times, your local newspaper, radio, and others are struggling for eyeballs and listeners and viewers and readers. Your input to them means more now than it ever did before. Especially if you're a subscriber and you threaten to cancel your subscription, or you actually cancel your subscription. But you need to be active and involved, and not just with the media, with labor unions, with church leaders, with your neighbors, on college campuses, the professors, as well as the students. And I want to focus on some specifics. It's important, if we understand that there's a truth that is separate from our political debate, then for instance, when the media reports that these riots and attacks on the border with Gaza have anything to do with Jerusalem and America's decision to recognize Jerusalem as its capital, that's patently absurd because of what the organizers of the demonstrations themselves say. These demonstrations going on for weeks have been called the March of Return. This has to do with the Nakba, with what they call the catastrophe of Israel's founding. This has to do with their blatant hostility towards Israel's existence, which I referred to before. You mustn't let those kind of references just pass you by, standing in front of the television and being angry and telling your spouse, they're such idiots. You need to write that email, make the phone call, or better yet, take the editor of your local newspaper out for lunch. Have a conversation about their coverage of foreign policy. This is what we do at Media Central in Jerusalem. One-on-one interactions where you actually get to know somebody. I'll tell you a little story just as a tangent. A few years ago, I challenged an audience in Silicon Valley to be more active. And I mentioned this very issue of personal interaction with the media, building on the credibility of mutual respect to help give a slightly different lens to the issues going on over there to the people who are responsible for the editorial coverage over here. And one fellow named Maury Shapiro, who's a real big activist in the Bay Area, decided to take the editor of the San Jose Mercury News to lunch, the foreign editor, to lunch one day. And he did. And they got to talking, and that's the whole point, is that you have a human interaction with somebody. And Maury learned that this editor was a fanatic soccer fan. I hate soccer, so I don't even know the name of the soccer team in San Jose. But whatever it is, this fellow, all his life was soccer. Now, Maury knew his stuff. That year, this is a few years ago, for the first time ever in Israel's history, the team from the town of Safnin, an Arab-Israeli town, had won the national championship. And Maury knew also that some 40% of the players in Israel's National Soccer League are Arab Israelis, mostly Muslims, some Christian. Using that lens for this foreign editor who cared about soccer, Maury was able to literally turn him 180 degrees from his original baggage, if you will, of hostility towards Israel as an occupier, to an understanding of the multicultural nature of Israel and our population, our Arab minority, and the like. I'm not suggesting that everything is rosy in Israel. We have issues dealing with our minorities, as just, by the way, if you've ever heard of a little movement called Black Lives Matter, other democracies also have issues of trying to deal with minorities in their society. We democracies have a challenge still. Europe with Turks in Germany and with Pakistanis in Britain and others, we all democracies have challenges dealing with our minorities and helping to embrace them and build a society that includes and that is inclusive. But this foreign editor found an entirely different lens with which to view Israel, Israel's history, current events, and Maury Shapiro was successful in doing that by simply creating a human relationship with him. So what I'm suggesting on this one example of this usage of the excuse, as if it's a reasonable excuse to protest America's recognition of Jerusalem as its capital, to go and send 40,000 people to break through an international border, and to allow violent acts of Molotov cocktails and shooting and burning tires and throwing rocks and the like, to somehow just be justified by a policy decision made by the United States of America. We can't let those kind of things pass. And just very quickly, I want to review with you some of the other words that I want you to be aware of. For instance, again, using just this last week, or the last few weeks, Are these peaceful protests on the border with Gaza? If you've seen any of the video footage, if you've heard any of the leaders of Hamas and Islamic Jihad describing what their goals are, cutting out the hearts of the Zionists as one example, we can demand of our media to describe this at least as a riot, if not as an attack. It is definitely not a peaceful protest or a demonstration that we're used to here in the West of waving placards and shouting slogans. A few other words to look for. Cycle of violence, excessive force, illegal settlements. Irrespective of how you feel about whether or not Jews should or shouldn't live in the disputed territories of Judea and Samaria, there are very few of them that are actually illegal under international law by a Western interpretation of international law. I'm not talking about Arab interpretations or even Russian interpretations. So we can talk about those Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, and we can even oppose them without agreeing that this adjective illegal is appropriate to attach to the description. And the last word that I want to address briefly is the word occupation. We have a serious problem in that Israeli leaders themselves, let alone pro-Israel leaders here in Israel, and media that counts itself as pro-Israel, uses the term occupation or occupied territories frequently. I heard it this morning on Fox News, talking about the occupied territories. Because it's shorthand. But that shorthand is so very dangerous. Because by definition, it accepts the concept that Israel is an illegal occupier of somebody else's land. I'm not here to argue that Israel should remain forever in Judea and Samaria. I can make that argument. And I can back it with facts and history and law. But I can also make the argument that it's reasonable for us to consider an Israeli withdrawal from those territories. And therefore, the political argument as to whether or not Israel should encourage or allow for the establishment of a Palestinian state in what is basically the heartland of the Jewish people in Judea and Samaria, reasonable people can debate what Israel should or shouldn't pursue as effective policies to try and reach a peace agreement and real peace with their neighbors. But the use of that term is just nefarious. Because there is a legal definition of occupation under the Geneva Convention, which is when one nation belligerently occupies the sovereign territory of another nation without cause. And not only have I already referred to the defensive nature of Israel's legal military operations in the '67 war, but we have prior legal claim under the terms of the mandate, under the terms of the San Remo Treaty, which was never abrogated by the United Nations in its charter. In fact, just the opposite. It was for the issue of what was then known as Palestine that the UN Charter has a paragraph saying explicitly that no international legal instruments will be affected by the UN Charter. But we allow ourselves to use these terms which imply that we are an occupier. Do you know who's an occupier? Turkey in northern Cyprus is an occupier after a belligerent invasion of territory to which it had no prior claim. There are others, obviously China and Tibet and others that you can use as historical or present-day examples. The point I'm making is simple. I insist with the media that we work with, and we have had great success with a number of leading international media outlets who have changed their language from describing the territories as occupied to describing them as disputed. Because if you want the most balanced term to relate to these territories, if you want to say this has to be resolved one day because there are different claimants, even though Eugene Rostow is one of the authors of Resolution 242 in 1967, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for the United States of America, and later was a law professor and the head of the Yale Law School. And he said a number of times, including just before his death, that there are two legal claimants to those areas. And it is very probable from a strictly legal perspective that Israel has the more powerful claim. under international law. But if we don't want to get into those arguments, the least that we can do, and the least I'm asking you to do, is to insist that the terminology used is disputed territories and not occupied territories. So that's really getting into the nitty-gritty of this myth that this is somehow a territorial or national conflict, and instead understanding this is a civilizational conflict that expresses itself in the use of specific language and reporting and discussions in the public sphere, which we need to insist become more accurate. And that's why I would say that one aspect of our Zionism today is to stand up and be counted, to be much more proactive. If you're already active, be more active and more frequent. And if you're not active, then get out there and be active. Because it's not an issue of whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, whether you're observant or not observant, even whether you're a Jew or a Christian or otherwise. What we're talking about here is literally the future of Israel being dependent on how our younger generation, meaning people younger than most of us sitting here, under the age of 50, view Israel and its legitimacy. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs wrote a while ago that Judaism is a religion of argument, which is very true. And we like arguing. The pilpul in the Gemara is something that we have inherited and goes on today. Rabbi Shirazi used to say in his days as a politician, when I worked with him in Israel, that if you don't disagree with government policy in Israel, you have no future as a politician, irrespective of which government we're talking about. So we are a religion of argument, but this is the time to band together. And I'm looking at the clock and cognizant of the fact that we have to wrap up within the next 10 minutes or so, but I want to share with you a thought that comes out of my experience of walking the land of Israel, because what happened to me in my hike across the country was not just the contemplative silences that I mentioned in the desert, that I could relate to you more perhaps later if you'd like. Not the personal transformative experience only of my getting over my divorce and literally physically moving on with my life and obviously in a less literal sense as well. But the people that I met walking through Israel were such a fundamental, important part of the experience. The truth is, the historical connection to the land was incredible also. Not just the beautiful geography in the desert or the forests of the north, but also the fact that I really felt time and time again that I was walking in the footsteps of our ancestors. That our forebears, literally, the children of Israel, walked through the Midbar Tzin, the desert of Tzin, which I was walking through. Our prophets walked the Judean desert, as did King David when he was escaping from King Saul, from Shaul HaMelech. There in the same Judean desert that I was walking. I was hiking up the Roman road that Karen and I were just talking about, part of the Israel Trail that hikes up towards Jerusalem, where there are still steps from the time the Romans were there, and our forefathers were there too, using those steps. I was moved to tears in Sipuri, this hub of our ancient civilization from 2,000 years ago, where I walked from house to house, and each house had a mikvah. Now, I know as an Orthodox Jew that my observance today is not exactly like their observance was 2,000 years ago. But I also know that these are my fathers and fathers' fathers, and these are my ancestors, that this is my people. And the connection that I had walking through that land of Israel reinforced for me my commitment, my personal commitment to my Zionism, and also, obviously, my commitment to our national sense of mission and meaning. But just as strongly as that's true, the connections that I made with the people of Israel, right and left, Moroccan immigrants that I stayed with as trail angels, an institution I'd love to talk more about if you'd like me to later, unique to Israel on the trail. You don't see this in the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Crest Trail or the Pilgrim's Trail in Spain and Portugal or in Nepal or anywhere else, where people open their homes to shvilistim, to people hiking the shvil, and give us a bed and a shower and often a meal, resupply, sometimes do our laundry. Phenomenal. And I stayed with immigrants from Cochin, India, on the Moshav Lachish, and I stayed with even people who aren't part of our Jewish family but are, because they're Israelis, Bedouin and Druze, the Black Hebrews in Dimona, others that I describe in my book. The people that I met on the trail, hikers, people who hosted me, people who I ran into in a makolet as I was buying stuff to resupply, people who would honk at me as they were driving by. We are one people. And the UJA used to use that as a fundraising tagline. And it was correct, it was true, but it's something that we sometimes ourselves forget, I think. And to a certain extent, it's something that we can think about as we move towards Shavuot. Because the idea of Ma'amar Har Sinai, the giving of the Torah at Sinai, I want to connect not only to my and our experiences of the silence of the desert, but also to this idea that Rashi talks about, that we were Am Echad Balev Echad as we stood to receive the Torah at Sinai. We were one people with one heart. I know, because I've heard, that this idea of unity as a people is something that you here in Milwaukee share very strongly, in ways I think that we in Israel could learn from, in terms of the feeling of unity and brotherhood, as it were, of connection between us all as members of one tribe, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, non-observant, right-wing, left-wing, you name it. Because we have all these multiple identities, but we are so much more than our political arguments. If I connected to our people and our land and our history in my walk on the Israel Trail, you don't have to walk the Israel Trail for 8 weeks with a 50-pound pack on your back. Did I mention I had a 50-pound pack on my back? In order to have that sense of connection. You can feel that at Pesach, on any given Shabbat. I know in your community that you have that feeling of togetherness. At Shavuot, when we learn together, perhaps across even the divides that we have in our community between different religious communities. I would say also, as I try and close, bringing together a few of the themes that I've shared with you about the trail, about our peoplehood, about the importance of being active and articulating that sense of national identity, even in the midst of our political arguments. I would invite you to come and hike the Israel Trail. I would invite you, in fact, as I close, I might ask, is it Abby? If you wouldn't mind putting on the slideshow again, just because this one shot of the Hermon, which I took from Kibbutz Dafna as I started up in the north, is lovely, but the overall presentation of all the different aspects that there are to see and discover in hiking the land of Israel, I'm happy to have them behind me as we conclude. Come and hike. Hike for a day. Hike for 2 days. In the north or in the south. I know most of you have visited Israel, but what I want to say is there is something important about getting out and walking, not driving, not riding in a bus, not flying over with a plane. I want you to, maybe just for a second, imagine, close your eyes if you want to, imagining my coming into the Judean desert. Most of you probably don't know that the largest nature reserve in Israel is called the Judean Desert Nature Reserve. Nobody's ever heard of it. Nobody ever visits it. Why not? There's nothing there. Literally. I'm not speaking in a hyperbole. I hiked through the desert in the south where there are shrubs, where there are ants and beetles, where there are birds. The Judean Desert National Reserve has rocks, gray and black rocks, and sand. At some point a photo will come up that shows you that. You see my backpack standing against a pole with a sign that says Judean Desert. The day that I had in the Judean Desert, if you'll imagine with me, walking through a desert where there is nothing, there's not a sound. I loved the bird songs as I was walking elsewhere because I felt that they were accompanying me in a way. And in that day, 8 hours walking, all alone, without seeing a single soul, somehow this kol demamad daka, which Eliyahu uses to describe the still small voice, or as Jonathan Sacks translated it, a sound of a slender silence, was for me one of the most transformative experiences and days of the hike, because somehow I connected to the greater, I'll just say the universe, as it were, and to God, and to my people, and to my land. And so I'm suggesting that if you have the opportunity next time you visit Israel, it's something that I would invite you to at least consider. And while I'm on the subject, I don't know how many of you think about Aliyah. If you're planning on making Aliyah in the near future, so I want to say, somebody who did so 35 years ago, welcome. If you're not planning on it, then I would hope you'd consider it. I'd hope you think about it. As much as this community is beautiful and embracing and important, there's something about living this experience of this miracle of the renewed sovereignty of the Jewish people in our ancestral homeland that cannot be replaced. And so I hope I'm not a one-man Aliyah activist, but I'd hope that you'd at least consider it as part of your life's planning. And then, even if not, of course, coming to visit Israel, I would hope is part of your own personal agenda. And I understand there's some discussions of perhaps organizing a community mission to Israel for the shul or for the federation. And all I can say is, coming and visiting Israel, as many of you I know have done, and hiking the land, I know and I hope to enjoy hiking tomorrow or the next day while I'm here, Haven Woods or Lapham Peak, and I know that they're beautiful. I've seen pictures of them. But the beauty and the significance of hiking in the land of Israel is 1,000 times greater. So I look forward to welcoming all of you, or some of you, for a visit or a pilot trip, or considering making Aliyah, or on a mission together, to come and sip some wine with me on my balcony as we watch the sunset over Nachal Sorek, the Sorek Valley, walk through my vineyard in my backyard, and talk a little bit more about our connections that we have together to each other as a people, as a family, really, and to our ancestral homeland and to our modern nation-state of Israel. Thank you.
Aryeh, that was wonderful. You really hit it out of the park. We do have about 10 minutes for some question and answers. Is your microphone working? Yes. Okay, so out of respect to everyone who might have a question, please keep your question in a question format. Save any anecdotes for dessert reception. I'll come around.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk. My husband and I are going to Israel in October, and we haven't really totally planned out what we're going to do. And we are hikers. Oh. So I'm wondering if there's a particular website or organization where we could get information about guided hiking. I don't think we'd want to go out on our own. I'm not really familiar with the landscape, but we will want to do some hiking.
Absolutely. First of all, you're welcome to take my card. There are a few in the back, and send me an email. I'm happy to provide a bit of insight if you tell me kind of what you're more interested in. But yes, there are a number of different websites. There's one called Israel National Trail in English, maintained by Yaakov Sar, who wrote the Red Guide, which is the informal but kind of official guide to hiking the Israel Trail. And there's a plethora of information there, and also on Israel's national parks and the nature spread of information about the trail. So all you have to do is decide what you're looking for, hills or Jerusalem area or the north, or forests, or the desert in the south, and there's a lot of information there. Sure. Another question? So I'm very happy to have this one here. I was just going to say, I'm certainly happy to stay around afterwards while we have dessert and to answer questions individually. But yes.
In my interactions with the community in general, not the Jewish community necessarily, although sometimes it is very hard to answer people who have a lot of hostile viewpoints about Israel. You made a lot of good points, but it's hard to even start. Suggestions?
Actually, I appreciate the question because this really hasn't been a discussion of Israel advocacy, but that's something that I speak about a lot. And I do have an answer. Henry Kissinger once said, while going on stage, one of his assistants asked him, are you ready? Are you prepared? He said, I hope their questions are as good as my answers. He knew what he wanted to say, and said, but this is a great question because I happen to have, I think, a compelling answer. One of the biggest challenges we have today is because of that hostility, many people who are in the middle, or even who are on the hostile side, view any answer that is defensive of Israel, defending Israel, they just discount it. Oh, you're just a pro-Israel advocate. So one of the things that I found very effective, with journalists in particular, and the 20-odd years that I've been working with the media, also with political leaders, and especially with students on college campuses, is first and foremost to empathize genuinely, not just mouthing the words, but let's face it, most of the criticism of Israel comes from the left side of the political spectrum, and it has to do with rights, and it has to do with our defensive military operations and the like. So the first thing that I do is that I have personally bona fides of having been involved in back-channel discussions with Palestinian leaders for a decade, having been involved in promoting democracy and human rights in Palestinian society, but also Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan, Syria, because I was privileged enough to work with Natan Sharansky, and that was my responsibility, was connecting him to Arab democracy and freedom and human rights activists. So the first thing that I do is to say, we agree. Palestinians, other Arabs, Muslims, Christians in the Middle East deserve a better life. Let's talk now about who is violating the human rights of Arab Christians, Arab Muslims, those who self-define as Palestinians or others. The first thing that I would say in answer to your question of how do we relate, how do we respond to that hostility, is almost a Dale Carnegie response in his book, How to Make Friends and Influence People. I mean, the title, we don't have to go into, the title says it all. Make friends first, and then you can hope to influence. And again, it's not manipulative. If you create a human connection and we recognize that because of our Jewish values, because of Israel as a democratic, free, liberal society, we care about issues like women's empowerment, like freedom of the press, like freedom of religion, not just women's rights, but gay rights and other issues. We have a common language with those who criticize Israel. Now let's talk about how can we forward a mutual agenda of bringing peace to the region. Then we can disagree. Should a Palestinian state be established? Would it be justified? Maybe it's artificial, but okay, still the time has come, we should do it. Where should it be? Maybe in Jordan, because that's 70% of the original Palestine mandate. Or no, maybe it could be in Judea and Samaria and the disputed territories. But on the other hand, how do we have some sort of a federation or confederation? But all of that pales in comparison to the issue of the repression, the violent repression of Palestinian society by the leaders of Hamas and Fatah today. So let's work together to try and right the wrongs that do exist, and then we can get into a discussion of what responsibility Israel has for some of the issues and some of the suffering in Gaza or by others in the Arab sector or elsewhere. So that would be my very, very first answer to your question, and if you'd like afterwards, I'm happy to talk more, but I don't want to keep everybody as a captive audience. Yeah. Sorry, you're in charge of the microphone, so you decide. It was.
All right, that's all for questions.
Yeah.
think Yale had a question.
I would like to know where the millions of environmentalists are when they see the Arabs burning tires and destroying our environment.
I agree with you, and I think that's we can leave that there because it is one of the more powerful, important, powerful arguments that we definitely have in terms of the way things are presented.